Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody. This is Howard Fox, and welcome to the Success Insight podcast. For my co-host, Randy Ford, I hope you are having a fantastic start to your October. Our guest today on a Success Insight podcast is W.G. Hladky. Bill is a retired homicide detective from the Miami-Dade Police Department, and before becoming an officer, he was also a newspaper reporter, and he is also a published poet. Bill has lived in Germany, where he taught street survival skills to American MPs. And today, when he's not writing, he's traveling around the country explaining to police officers how violent encounters impact our psychological and physiological responses. Bill is also the author of a new series of science fiction novels, the Book of Ruin series. And the Book of Ruin, his first book, was published in 2018, and the FlashFall Sword, which is actually a prequel, was published this year in 2019. Bill, welcome to the Success Insight podcast.
Thank you, Howard.
So I have to ask, when I was reading about the books, post-apocalyptic science fiction, I'm curious what the distinction was, because as I was reading, I'm thinking post-apocalyptic, but then does that sit within the science fiction genre? How does that line up? I'm curious.
I would say it does, but when I was writing the book, I wasn't thinking about finding something that would fit in a particular genre. It's science fiction because I invent certain scientific machines or machines that do not exist now. And so that's how it came about. And also, I talk about a future that existed after a series of solar storms basically destroyed modernity or the modern way of life throughout the earth, and how mankind would recover. And I go into kind of a fictional history of how they recover.
Okay. I want to get into the books, the Book of Ruin, the FlashFall Sword, but I think our listeners would also like to learn a little bit more about you. And I'm also with an added angle is, how did you come to, say, write this book? What was that moment of insight, that inspiration to write the book? So share a little bit about your story from being a detective in Miami. And by the way, you weren't the real version of Don Johnson in Miami Vice, were you?
No, I didn't work narcotics. I worked traditional investigations like robbery and homicides. Don Johnson worked narcotics. I was there during that time, but I basically went more of a traditional track in investigations.
Now, I can't believe I would be the first person to ever ask you that, am I?
No.
Okay, good. I didn't want you to think this guy is totally off the wall here. So you spent some time in the force. You were also a newspaper.
30 years.
How many years? 30. 30-some years. That's a long time. For most people, that's a career, and I'm ready to retire and then be done. But you haven't been done. You've done a lot of other work in addition to the being the detective. Talk a little bit about the writing and poetry and in some ways how that perhaps has influenced creating these science fiction novels.
Well, until I retired, my readings were mainly nonfiction, a lot of politics, a lot of history. And I have 2 master's degrees, which are not in literature. The one's in public administration, and the other one is in criminal justice with an emphasis on forensic behavior. So getting into fiction was kind of a surprise to me, too. How this came about, though, is that, like you mentioned, I lived in Europe for several years. I got a leave of absence from the department because my wife got a job over there. And I've probably been to Europe a dozen times. And what's so interesting about Europe is just that the history, the depth of history is all around you. Where I grew up in Iowa, the only history are the Civil War Union cannons that surround the State House. Mm-hmm. And I would drive all around Germany at the time going to my classes, and I would pass, medieval castles or ruins of middle-aged fortresses or even well-preserved medieval towns that even to this day, if you had a brutal a knight from the past that happened to time warp to the future, he would feel comfortable because it's so well-preserved. And I'm driving around, I also spot German TV towers, and they're different from what we have in the States. They're called Fernsehturms. And usually at the top of these towers, there's like a big globe type structure where several rooms and floors and sometimes restaurants are there. And it's something unique to Germany. The most famous one is Berlin. So as I'm driving around, I see these ruins, and then I see these TV towers, and at times they kind of hit me as if they're also from the Middle Ages. So I started thinking, what would happen to these towers if all of a sudden modernity collapsed? Would they be used by the people as castles, or would they tear them apart like a lot of Roman ruins were torn apart after the fall of the empire? So I started thinking about that. And from there, the idea just kept spinning around my head until after I retired and I had some time, I thought, well, let me play around with that concept. And also one thing else I realized living in Germany is that there is a very large American presence there, a lot because of the military, and it's very well integrated in society. And there's a lot of Americans who are civilians that work for the Defense Department, but they live their entire career there. And there's a lot of intermarriage between the Americans and the Germans. And so also I was thinking, well, what would happen to this American community if all of a sudden they were trapped in Germany because of the fall of modern life? They were unable to get back to the United States. These are some of the questions I had that kept spinning around my head that I decided I'd explore.
Interesting. Now, I'm curious too. I saw I believe it was on the website or within the Book of Ruin, your book number 1, and then the FlashFall Sword, book number 2, that there was the map. And so the entire story then for both books right now take place within, what is considered Germany today or within the surrounding countries. Is that pretty much where the story takes place?
Yeah, I would say Central Europe. In the FlashFall Sword, we introduce some very violent, primitive people, and they are called Shadowlanders, and they live in the Shadowland, and which they took over, which is France. And in the location of various cities, like Obama City and the German city, which I call the Germans Teutons, those are actual locations of real cities. I just changed the names of the cities. I talk about the Hungarian plains, which is obviously Hungary, and also Slovakia, which is really a combination of Poland and the Czech Republic.
I also noticed there's a new Reykjavik. Reykjavik?
Right. That is basically located at Kyiv in Ukraine. One thing I point out is that because of the fall of modern life brought on by this constant solar storms that keep striking the United States, I guess I should explain that a little bit, because scientists know that a good set of solar storms could wipe out all of our electronics. There's been several times where they've actually shut down electrical systems and caused, like in the 19th century, telegraph wires were actually ignited and put on fire because they were overwhelmed by the solar particles that hit the Earth. So, that's what brought down, in my mind, in my stories, that's what brought down modern life.
That's very interesting. A couple of weeks ago, I had a guest on who, very nice man. I really enjoyed the conversation. And what was interesting about it is he is a climate change, I wouldn't say denier, I would say skeptic. And his premise was there's nothing extraordinary about the changes in climate. The data doesn't pinpoint things are worse today versus where they were 50, 100, 150, 200 years ago based on measuring and analyzing the data, though there is certainly humanity's impact on our climate. And it's interesting with your story, the fallout from the cosmic storms, that is something totally outside of our control. So even if we could have planned for it, from your writing and the research you were doing, this type of event, it's a very real event that it has happened, but can certainly happen again.
Well, there are ways to protect our electronic infrastructure. The problem is very expensive, and the electrical companies just don't want to put the money into it. But also in my series of books, the electrical storms keep coming. So we're never able really to recover. And that's the background. But at the same time, I talk about, and I don't really get into it, but there is climate change in my stories. For example, there's an ice pack that crept closer to northern Germany, where it's constantly present. And part of the reason, in my mind, which I don't get into it, is because of the Gulf Stream is basically shut down. And there's researchers saying because of all the ice that is starting to melt and get into our oceans, it's fresh water, and fresh water will eventually could shut down or slow down the Gulf Stream. That it keeps parts of Europe warmer than normal. So, I mean, I play around with that sort of stuff too. But really what the two books really emphasize is friendship, camaraderie, people struggling together. The world of which I create, I build, is a background to give them a stage which to struggle in. And I have, because of my experience as a police officer during the bad old days in Miami, where crime back then was 3 times higher than it is now, I went through the experience of getting very close to the people I worked with, to the other officers, because it was almost like a low-grade war. You're just going to call, and the crime and the homicides are just everywhere. So what happened is that I really emphasized camaraderie and the friendships, and also the loves that is instilled in people that have to share danger. And I emphasize that in both books.
So in the first book, The Book of Ruin, you have the hero, perhaps, or is it one hero? Is it a group of heroes? I mean, and you have the remnants of this United States force, or I guess it's NATO. Is there more than one hero? Is it just the main one? And there's obviously the protagonist.
Well, there's a collection of heroes, but they work together. And in the world that I built, there's 2 institutions that survived, which allows some semblance of old values or pre-collapse values to survive. And one institution is the church. And I just call it the church because the church in history has always been important to hold people together. And the other one is NATO, and that is really the military arm. And the heroes are NATO Rangers, and the leader is a senior chief that I call Ware, W-E-I-R, Ware, but he has a team, and the team are a collection of various characters, and they all have their little quirks, and they all have their own little different personalities, but they struggle together, and at the end, they are very tightly bound because of what they survived. And also, I have in the first book especially, I have an enemy, and the enemy comes from the Eurasian steppes. Again, this goes back to how the geography of that area, because we had, and I don't know many people know this, but there's a vast steppe or prairie that goes from Ukraine all the way to China. And historically, like Genghis Khan, when he invaded Europe, he went along these steppes. So my bad guys in the first book, they're not Genghis Khan type of bad guys, but they came from the east into Europe through the vast steppes.
Now, the FlashFall Sword is actually, though it's book 2 in the series, it's actually a prequel to the Book of Ruin. As the book ends, now you have plans for a third book in the series?
Yeah, I'm writing a third book, and maybe this is kind of unique or unorthodox, but I kind of jump around. The second book takes place 100 years before the first book. Then the third book, which I'm already started, takes place in the future, like 160 years after the first book. But in every book, the heroes are from the same family of Wares. So it follows kind of a generational aspect of this family. And that's what I'm doing. And each book has different challenges. Like, again, the first book was bad guys coming from the east through the Eurasian steppes. The second book are very violent, primitive tribes from the west, from France, that threaten NATO and the church. The whole thing about the second book is, where did these primitives come from? And that's the big reveal at the end of the book.
Gotcha. I'm curious, within both books, I mean, you've got the enemy. I would guess it's the protagonist. You've got the heroes, the people who are doing their best to hold society together. So the combination of the church and NATO. I'm also curious, just given the nature of our politics today, is where do the politicians fit into this? Are they like they are today?
Well, in the first book, it's not the extreme politics of today. I'm Believe it or not, I may be getting into that in the last book or the third book, which I'm writing now. But in the first book, you have a Senate that controls what I call Teutonic America. This is the combination of the German city-state and the American city-state that have come together to form a small realm. But you have the senators, but then you have the wealthy landowners that try to control how money is spent. You have the church that is very pacific. They want to make a deal with these invaders to protect their interests. So there's a lot of political intrigue also involved in the first book. The second book is the political intrigue exists, but a lot of it involves the fact that there's a spy in the church or in NATO that's helping out the primitives.
Gotcha. I'm curious, and maybe this kind of puts you on the spot, is as you were writing these books, what did you learn about yourself as either as a writer, as a storyteller? What's inspiring you to kind of expand and add additional elements or clarity, complexity to your universe?
I mean, that's a good question. There's a couple of things. Number one, the first book took about 4 years to write for the simple reason I did not know how to write fiction. I could write, but after 30 years of writing police reports, very complex police reports, that's much different on how to write fictions. And again, when I first started writing the first book, I wasn't thinking, well, I'm going to publish this. Sent it to some professionals, and a lot of them said this is crap, which it was, but they really couldn't tell me how to write. I mean, they would throw out certain phrases saying, show, don't tell, but they never really explain it. And really the book that really helped me was writing novels for dummies, because it was just very simple. Then I was very lucky. I found an editor who I had to pay, but she was very, very good at explaining and help in editing it down. And I used her for both books. So that was one thing I found out. The second thing is that, and this goes to the question, which you haven't asked, but a lot of people have, why aren't I writing about police work? Because that's really my background. And the reason is that I want to have fun writing this.
Right. I
want to go to a world I enjoy being there. This is supposed to be a fun read, even though I've had some criticism that there's too much violence in it, even though my violence I describe as historically based. But the thing with me, and even though I'm very proud of what I did as a police officer, even though I still lecture as 2 police officers, I'm very proud of that, I cannot romanticize police work. And I think for a good fiction writer, you have to it has to be some of the romance between you and the story you're telling. And I just cannot do that. The same way, like most cops, they won't watch police TV dramas.
Right.
They just can't, because what they see on TV doesn't fit what they actually know. And there's just no romance to it. And then also, as you mentioned at the beginning, my wife and I have always traveled. We enjoy traveling, and I just love exotic worlds. To me, they're exotic. I love how people live different lives, and so I try to re-experience that as I'm writing my stories. But the books are supposed to be like a good summer read.
Well, something when we were first having our conversation about coming on the podcast and looking at the books and the genre, and I'm thinking, yep, that's a book you take to the beach with you, or sit outside when it's nice out in summer and just then kind of have a good read and an iced tea or an adult beverage, whatever your choice is. I'm curious, and now that the books are out, you're writing number 3, and folks, we will provide links back to Bill's book on the Amazon page where they're located. So no fear for that. Bill, in the minutes we have left together, if folks want to learn more about you and your work, find ways to stay in touch with you about your books, what's the best way to do that? Well,
I have a website, which is wghladkyauthor.com. Again, my last name is Czech. So to a lot of people, it's missing the vowel, but it's Hladky. They can go there. If they're interested in the seminar that I participate in, they can go to Surviving Violent Encounters. We have a website there where I have my police bio there.
Okay. And now, besides the books, do you also have a blog or any other writings that people can kind of keep an eye on what you're up to in the writing space?
Well, what I do is if you go to my website, WG Hladky Author, it asks you if you want to sign up for the newsletter. And once a month, I send out a newsletter, explain some of the research I'm doing, or like when I'm, or the podcast I'm on. And then also on that website, there's a button for the blog where I will also post those newsletters on the blog page.
Very good. Very good. And we'll also provide links to that in our show notes as well. A couple quick questions. And one is within the books, are your readers, are they middle-aged men like me? Are they teenagers? Who's the audience? And then what's been the reaction to the books from the folks who have been reading it, perhaps outside of your near and dear family and friends who want you to be a New York Times bestseller? What's been the reaction to the book?
Well, I find it interesting because some of the people, especially women, are somewhat taken back by the violence, especially in the second book. But the violence is there to make a point, especially on when you get to the end of the book and you explain where these primitives came from. But other people really enjoy it because it pulls you into a world and that they never imagined. And also I find out that a lot of the people that really enjoy the book are like professionals. Like thinking about a couple of psychologists that read them, that they just really enjoy it. So it's kind of mixed.
Okay. Well, I tell you, I am very anxious to sit down and when I have time to read the books. I mean, I love science fiction. I grew up reading science fiction novels and even more perhaps into the fantasy realm. But nonetheless, I mean, it's a great story. I love the history. I mean, I never got to Germany, and though I was in France for a little bit. But, just the history and things that you see there, those towers, I'm really kind of fascinated with. I know there's a big one in London, but just the kind of ideas about those and just the surrounding area is very interesting. In our final few moments together, Bill, in our show towards the end, we like to ask our guests an insight to go. And insight to go is kind of a way for our guests to share, whether it's a quote, an idea, a tip, anything that you want to leave our listeners wanting more and to perhaps learn more about you and your books. Is there any insight to go that you'd like to share with us?
Appreciate the people you work with. In modern society, I know that we're so individualized. We're all so competitive. But if those who've been in the military or police work where you have to rely on people, you really realize, the strength that comes from helping each other. Like in the books, there's various characters, and these characters, especially in the first book, came from people. The base of the characters are people I actually know. So when they're reading the books and they think, well, this is not a real character. Yeah, that's a real character. However, what happens once you start writing, the character takes on a life of its own. But the importance is, if you are in a situation where you're working with a group of people for a long time, cherish the fact that you're comrades.
Thank you so much for that. We appreciate that. And again, congratulations on the books, and looking forward to hearing about book number 3 in the series. Thank you so much again. We really appreciate you joining us on the Success Insight podcast. Well, there you have it, folks. We were just chatting with Bill Hladky. You can find his books on Amazon. This is the Book of Ruin series. The books are by W.G. Hladky, Hladky. Again, we're going to provide links to the book on his website. We'll also provide a link back to his author page, and I know he even has a Facebook page as well. We'll link there too. A very interesting story. I mean, we definitely were into the fiction realm here. We can't be all business and nonfiction. And in our day, sometimes we need to kind of step back, decompress. And what better way to do that than read a good book or two? So we hope you enjoyed today's show. For my co-host, Randy Ford, this is Howard Fox. Thank you again for joining us on a Success Insight podcast. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there and have a phenomenal day. And we'll see you again on the next episode. Bye now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.